Pleasure and honor to welcome you as chairperson to tonight's special Asia Thinker Series session held in conjunction with our school's Festival of Ideas, which is a chance to bring together scholars and practitioners around really important policy challenges facing our planet, facing Southeast Asia, and facing Singapore. I just want to make a note that in the last 2 years, many critical challenges that COVID-19 has since thrown the world into has left a world highly disrupted and wanting of much more social emphasis in how we build policies and initiatives today that reflect our own social well-being. Which today we are very excited to dive into a discussion about policymaking and people's happiness. Do we need a new social contract? For our virtual participants, we invite you to join our conversation by answering three poll questions during this session. And don't forget to send us your questions too, as we discuss this really exciting topic ahead. Also, please refer to your chat message if you are on Zoom, or the comment box if you're on Facebook Live for instructions. Okay, Zoom comment, Facebook Live instructions. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to introduce the first of our 4 speakers. And just so you know the plan for today, each speaker will speak for around 8 minutes each. We'll then have a moderated discussion with myself and the panelists based on their presentations. And then we'll have the exciting sharing of the poll results. Again, do not forget to be engaged. And then we'll engage in a question and answer with you, the audience, as well, followed by a few moments of closing remarks. With that, it is my honor for me to now formally introduce to you the first of our panelists, Professor Kuan, who is a tenured professor at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management in Korea. He obtained his PhD in economics at the University of British Columbia and an MA in economics and BA in business administration from Peking University. His research lies mainly in subjective well-being, economic development, and the Chinese economy. His papers have been published in many economics and interdisciplinary journals. He is also an associate editor, and this is important, a founding member of the World Happiness Report at Columbia University. The preparation of the first World Happiness Report is based at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, which shares synergies in its thinking and ideas and approach with our new Institute for Environment and Sustainability, the logo behind me. But this, along with Columbia and the Center for Economic Performance at LSE and the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and through their grants, produced this report. The central base for the reports since 2013 has been through the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, directed by Jeff Sachs. So with that, now I turn open to our first presenter, and welcome.
Well, sorry, can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ben. It's my great pleasure to be invited to join this Asia Thinker webinar system series. And I'm very happy to share my experience and my knowledge on this specific topic, which is a very interesting and also very important issue, which is about the policymaking and people's happiness. Well, I have been a researcher on the economics of happiness for over a decade, and have been also actively participating in making the World Happiness Report. Well, so today I'll briefly introduce you the concept of happiness and how it is linked with the policy making, and what can the policymakers and other NGOs do to improve the people's happiness. Next slide, please. Well, first I will show you that there has been growing interest in happiness in recent decades. Well, happiness is not a new word to people, but the research on this topic, has been just increasing very rapidly in recent decades, which can be shown, from the records. Well, next I'm gonna show you the trend of the words of happiness has been used in the books, in the published books, comparing to other keywords. So we can see the trends of the word, and which reflect people's interest in this topic. Next slide, please. Well, the figure is taken from one chapter of World Health Report 2022, done by one of our invited, contributor. So basically, we use the Google Books Ngram system to show the dynamic trend of the keywords such as the happiness and GDP and many other keywords. We can see the trend of the frequency of those words used in those books. Well, clearly you can see that the word happiness has been increased very rapidly, since 1990s. Well, as you can see from the left panel. In the right panel, you can also see the people's interest has been increased for other beyond GDP measures such as the GPI. And also the World Health Report has been, the word has been increased very rapidly since early 2012. Well, so next slide, please. Well, if you look into this in details, we can see the frequency in different languages, across languages. Well, in general, we see an increase in the word of happiness in all of the languages we have been surveyed in the paper. Well, of course, in some countries like, China and Germany, there has been a much rapid increase in the word using in books. Well, on the contrary, on the other hand side, you can see that in terms of economic growth, generally we see either a inverted U shape or a decreasing trend of using the word in the books. Well, next one, please. Well, those are just, the previous two slides show you the frequency of the words used in all kinds of books published. But if we look at the specific literature, happiness in academia, we can see also an increasing trend in both, economics, psychology, and, even we count all those literature in social science. Well, we can see a clear increasing trend in those, literature. That means there have been more and more studies on the topic. Next, please. Well, since happiness has been, a very important topic, but why it has been largely ignored in earlier research, in earlier study, particularly in economics before 1990s. Well, we know that in the standard economic theory, people care a lot about those people's income, preference, and then based on the preference, we make people's utility function, so that we can, maximize people's utility based on the budget constraint. Therefore, based on this kind of ordinal preference theory, we can get a very simple result that people's utility is based on their income. Well, that means for a whole society, income is very important, or is a key determinant of people's welfare. So that's why we have been cared a lot about, people's income and the GDP per capita, for the whole society. Well, so there has been a long history of, studying this income And I think it's a very important outcome variable to measure people's welfare and well-being in a whole society. Next, please. However, GDP may not be just equal to welfare or well-being, because there are many concerns about what is included in GDP or what is excluded from it, and or whether the weight represents a contribution of different types of spending on to the overall well-being. Well, I'm not going into details here, but we do know that there are many issues which is included in the GDP actually represent a negative welfare, not a positive one. For example, the spending on dealing with the air pollution or to deal with this crime, and those kind of spending actually does not contribute to our welfare directly. And the emphasis on economic indicators such as GDP could also make people be more, materialistic and less attentive to many other important areas of life, such as social aspect of our life. Next, please. Well, we know that GDP is not perfect and it has many problems in measuring people's well-being. Therefore, researchers has been trying to include more items or more aspects in our life to measure people's well-being. For example, the capacity approach proposed by Amartya Sen. Later on, the UNDP extend the measure of well-being based on this theory to produce this HDI measure, which is called a Human Development Index. And this index, extend beyond just income per capita. It also includes education and health. But there are still problems with such kinds of conflicting measures, because how do you, assign weights to different indicators? And how do you know those just three important indicators there? There are many other aspects are not covered in this index. Anyway, there are many efforts has been, tried to improve the measurement of the people's well-being, trying to include more aspects of our life. However, economists also seek to measure our well-being based on, subjective measures. Next, please. Well, so the idea is very simple. If you want to know whether people are happy with their life, you can just ask them. You don't need to just look at what kind of jobs they have, what kind of house they have, and what their income. Well, why don't you just ask them directly? Well, this is what we learn from psychologists, actually. Next week. Well, the concept of happiness is defined as a self-reporting measure of well-being, which is just mainly or typically obtained by the questionnaire. It's like it mainly includes three distinct but often related components of well-being. It's like more frequent positive affect, infrequent negative affect, and cognitive evaluations of our own life. This definition is given by Ed Denner, which is often used by psychologists and also economists. Well, sometimes in the literature, happiness, this word is often used interchangeably with subjective well-being. Next, please. Well, people wonder if income or GDP per capita is not a perfect indicator. Well, how about happiness? Well, intuitively, we know it's not a perfect one, but we want to know whether income and happiness can tell a consistent story. Well, sadly, these not, because according to the pioneering study by Richard Easterling, the correlation between income and happiness is quite complex, actually. Well, in his seminal work, he just found that at a point of time, there is a positive correlation between income and happiness. However, if you look the correlation over time, the growth of the happiness may not be correlated with the growth of the income. So this is so-called Easterling paradox. Since then, there are more and more researchers are trying to explore what's going on behind the correlation. Next, please. Well, this just shows you briefly that there is a positive correlation between GDP per capita and life satisfaction, which is one of the measures for happiness you get from the Gallup World Poll. Next. However, if you look at this time series data in the United States, the percent of people who report being very happy just is not increasing. Well, even during that period, the economy was growing. Next, please. So the lessons we learned so far is that it's not just income. Well, we know income is important, but there are many other factors such as the economic environment, including like inflation, unemployment, social security net, and the political environment, social environment, physical, and even personal and family characteristics or matter for people's happiness. So it's not just income. Income is one important factor, but there are many other factors which cannot just simply reflected by income or G per capita. That means there are many other important factors which are important. Next. Next, please. Yeah. So that means there is a need for measuring happiness for public policy because national happiness itself is an important policy goal, as been stated by Aristotle, and also the UN General Assembly's resolution claimed that the pursuit of happiness is a fundamental human goal. Next, please. And happiness can be also used for economic analysis to identify the key determinants of happiness, to evaluating the non-market goods such as air pollution, environmental pollution, can be also used for to improving governmental and organizational effectiveness. Next. And because happiness is a very comprehensive measure, and it can provide a common metric that can be used to compare different outcomes in different areas. And the important items in our life can ultimately be reflected in the measure so that we can calculate the weight necessary to convert diverse indicators into aggregate measure of the quality of life. Because we don't need to assign weight to different important aspects of life. Instead, we can calculate based on the data. And happiness measure also allow for diversity of opinion about what could be a good life. It's not just the material aspect of our life. There are many other important components which are important for people's happiness. Next. So thus, I think many researchers call for more actions from the government and also non-government organizations. Just treat this measure more seriously and consider it as one of the core measures to guide their policies and actions. And we also call for the action from the official statistical agencies to collect the data and continuously and in a larger scale so that we can use the data better to inform our policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a really comprehensive overview of both the conceptual and also the sort of the data-driven aspects to what happiness is, how to measure it, and how to think about promoting it. So what a wonderful start to our conversation. I now want to turn to Dr. Ningko Ho, who is Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Case Study Unit and Social Inclusion Project at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. His research focuses on social inclusion and how public policies shape opportunities for participation. Recent projects examine homelessness, housing policy, minimum income standards, and income security. He led Singapore's first nationwide street count of homelessness and is co-editor of the book They Told Us to Move from Ethos Books. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. There are two parts to the title of this seminar, happiness and then social contract. So very aptly, Professor Shun Wang has introduced the concept of happiness, and then now I will introduce the concept of the social contract. In just the past 2 months, I've been involved in quite a number of dialogues regarding the social contract, especially with younger people. Wanting to discuss this, wanting to share their opinions about this is clearly an issue that in Singapore, it's a concern, and that gets people engaged, right? So I will be speaking about social contract in the context of Singapore, and also from the vantage point of research that I've been doing in the last few years, starting with pensions and old age income security, to minimum income standards for older people as well as working age households. More recently, work looking at income and security in the gig economy, and also a project we're developing on the future of work. So that's my starting point. In the next slide, um, I will I'll suggest that when we talk about a social contract, we can ask essentially three questions about it. The first is, what is a social contract? And then secondly, what is our, as in the social contract in Singapore? What's wrong with it, if indeed there is anything wrong? And if so, how should it change? So those are broadly the three topics I'll be touching on in the next few minutes. Next slide, please. So what is a social contract? I mean, there are many definitions for it, but the one I like best is probably the one that is also the title of an excellent book by economist and director of the London School of Economics, Minouche Shafiq, called What We Owe Each Other, right? I thought it very aptly captures the notion of a contract and the idea of mutual obligations. Another way to think about a social contract is that it consists of the norms and rules that govern our individual and collective lives. And this could be political rules to do with voting, for example, because each time you vote and pick a government, it usually comes with a set of ideas and an agenda about mutual responsibilities. These norms and rules could have to do with legal principles, such as those encoded in employment protection. It could have to do with economic norms, such as taxation, or social norms, such as healthcare arrangements and provisions. So there's a huge set of norms and rules that affect our lives. We could also think of a social contract as an allocation of risks between the state, the market, and the family. Allocation of risks, and therefore the allocation of responsibilities. Right? What sort of risk? The risk of old age, of income loss, disability, or sickness, and so on. Next slide, please. So if that is broadly speaking what a social contract is, what is Singapore's social contract? At one of the events that I mentioned that I spoke at recently about Singapore's social contract, someone in the audience asked, do we have one? I don't remember signing it. Which is one of those things about a social contract. We say a contract, meaning it's an agreement between two parties, but it's often unspoken. So I particularly appreciate this chart that's in the book I mentioned by Minouche Shafiq, What We Owe Each Other, where she compares the level of protection for workers against the flexibility for employers. So, I mean, those are two continuums, but you can broadly speaking divide this into a 2x2 kind of matrix, where protection means essentially health, education, and social security spending, right, for workers. And then on the other hand, flexibility for employers refers essentially to how easily you can do hiring and firing, right? So if there are four cells, you can think of the top right and the bottom left as kind of the rational approaches. Top right is high flexibility and high protection. I say it's because if you have a highly flexible system where workers are easily dismissed, then you need to have high protection to catch them when they lose their jobs. But countries with fewer resources, those in the bottom left, they opt for the other way of doing it, which is they may not have the resources to provide social protection, and therefore their systems tend to be fairly rigid. It's not so easy to fire workers because there isn't a safety net for them in society. So these are kind of the two rational approaches. Top left is, to put it very simplistically, top left is kind of overdoing it because it's low flexibility and high protection. Those are societies, many of them in Europe, for example. It's quite difficult to fire workers and yet when you do, there's quite a good protection for them, right? So those workers have a lot of security. Bottom right is doing, if top left is doing too much, bottom right is doing too little. And that's where Singapore is. High flexibility, easy to fire workers, but very low protection when they do get fired. And you can see it's quite a lonely cell. Singapore doesn't have much company in that cell. There is Uganda and Saudi Arabia. Next slide, please. So, I mean, the universal challenges for social contract are quite well known. There is population aging, there's technology and automation threatening the loss of jobs, there's increasing flexibility, casualization of work, moving risks to individuals. But in Singapore, there are some additional unique risks, right? That have to do with it being in the bottom right of that 2x2 matrix. For example, already fairly moderate to high inequality, slow social mobility, wage stagnation at the bottom of the distribution, a heavy dependence on the migrant workforce who face even worse work conditions than low-wage nationals. And of course, very fast aging, creating increasing pressure on the pension system that is essentially based on individual savings. So on top of kind of the universal pressure, Singapore also has unique weaknesses. So how should we change? I will end with this. I would suggest that to rethink Singapore's social contract, we can think along 3 lines. The first is prioritizing the meeting of basic needs. And to do that, we need to set minimum income standards, define basic needs, and then draw thresholds below which no one should fall. The second track along which change can happen is to ensure good work, decent work that pays people properly. In concrete terms, that means extending employment and wage protection to people in flexible work, but importantly, also improving social assistance. And this point is important because social assistance and wage work, they share the same market. If social assistance is very ungenerous, it allows the existence of low-wage work because it prevents exit from work that doesn't pay adequately. And finally, if we're expecting an economy where people are making more transitions across different kinds of work and between working and not working, then we need to make sure there is support for such transitions through training, through providing income support, and through providing adequate care services. I'll pause here and I look forward to taking questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that really wonderful presentation. And I'm glad to hear that political science is not the only discipline that requires a 2x2 table to analyze a complex world. I find that 2x2 table fascinating and it really resonates well, and we'll come back to that. And we'll come back to a question I have on, what would the recommendations you extrapolate from that 2x2 table mean for the way Singapore has developed into what is quite a miracle, many say, in this part of the world. But that, I just flag that for you to think about as we go to our next speaker, who is Dr. Srija Nair, and an assistant professor in our very own Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. She's got a very comprehensive CV. I'm going to give you a little brief snippet so we can get to her talk right away. But what's important to know about Srija is that she brings to policy studies an interdisciplinary approach and specializes in so doing in environmental policy and governance. And she focuses on the policy process and the tools of government for designing policies under significant uncertainty, looking at both the interplay of science and politics in that context. And you can imagine that it makes sense that she's brought this framing to think about climate change, food and water security, and more recently, the digital transformation and workforce resilience. She's author of a wonderful book that you must buy after this webinar, Rethinking Policy Piloting, Insights from Indian Agriculture, which is an amazing effort at both thinking about how do we, as governments, innovate and how do we address really practically important problems such as food security. More recently, she's been editor of a book on emerging pedagogies in education, insights from Asia. As you can tell, she brings a diverse set of lenses to a really important set of questions. And we look forward, therefore, to hearing her talk today on these two questions of happiness and the social contract.
Environmental and can you hear me?
Are we back now? Are we back? Yeah. There was some kind of technical issue. Can you hear Srisha now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, so my research at the Lee Kuan Yew School focuses on how governments address transitions of various kinds. These could be socio-technical and environmental transitions. So much of what I will share today in the next few minutes draws a lot from my own research in South Asia. Now, the nature of social contract is changing, as we heard the two speakers before me, that what social contract means it can be very varied, and that affects happiness of citizens and society at large. Now, I am in a public policy school that trains future academics, practitioners, and change makers for the betterment of society. Now, there have been articles and discussions on the relevance of a public policy school today in times when there are protests, citizen unrest, and dissatisfaction with governments in various parts of the world. So what is the role and relevance of a public policy school? There's also been a lot of discussion on what kind of skills do policymakers need in today's time. And apart from technical problem solving skills, how can we cultivate skills and virtues upon which happiness of a society, happiness of citizens rests? Now, earlier this week, I want to share this. Earlier this week, the National University of Singapore had a wellness session for its staff, which I also attended, where a renowned professor of psychology shared his research on 4 virtues: kindness, compassion, gratitude, and awe, or just wonder of the amazing things that the world has to offer, and how these are more important than ever for individuals and society as a whole, as we face the fallouts of war and displacement, climate change, mental health issues, economic uncertainties, pandemics, technological change, etc., and learn to cope and adapt to these changes and be happy. And what is the role of the governments in creating a happier society, or at the minimum removing any barriers to creating this for this happier society to survive and thrive, and one that can cope and adapt and stay resilient in the face of any kind of stress? So reflecting on this question, I will focus my comments on 3 points. First is, preparing for a future that is very different from current is challenging. And here I draw much of my work on environmental change and climate change, putting our bets on things which we don't see happening yet, but we hear that it is likely that it can happen in future. Technological change, innovation, technological change, moving to low carbon society, less consumerism, recycling, etc. People need to change the way they live for many of these to come to action. And there is no certainty in which of these strategies might work and how well might these work. So there is also an administrative burden of implementing new ideas, the costs that it would involve, the efforts that citizens have to put in learning about a new program, the administrative logistics around it, ensuring compliance, etc. Digital transformation of public services, for example. It is efficient, but if it's not delivered properly, it could widen existing inequalities, and there could be a steep learning curve for those who are not digital natives. Also, one of the tools that governments could leverage in this case, where there is a lot of uncertainty in what kind of strategy might work, is to try out new ideas by starting small and launching these as pilots. So much of my recent research talks a lot about an experimental culture in the governments and why this should be promoted. The second point that I'd like to highlight in the context of a new social contract is that ideas of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, not only now but intergenerational, it is defining and redefining some of the pressing societal problems the world is facing today, and also the crafting of solutions in response. The idea of differential vulnerability of the population, for example, to various kinds of environmental change is well known. Who shares the blame for climate change, for crime, for poverty, etc. There is a divide in urban services, for example, development for whom, progress for whom. How do we answer these tough questions, and how do we devise strategies which work not only for majority of the people, but also pays attention to the most marginalized? So how can policymakers account for diversity, inclusion, equity, justice in their policies? While talking of justice, I also want to bring in the changing relationship of the society and citizens with nature. You know, people value the environment and natural resources differently. The ones who are in proximity are the ones most likely to feel the immediate impacts and changes the most, be it in social, economic, or even psychological terms. But climate change is a different issue because its effects can be felt worldwide, and these will be differential. Now, many cultures around the world have developed in and around nature, you know, water bodies, forests, mountains. And an example which I use often in my classes is that pollution of water bodies, for example. When one draws water directly from a local lake, we are very mindful of the slightest change in its color, taste, turbidity, etc. But once we are away from this polluted source and water comes to us filtered through a pipe and a tap in the house, the problem is out of sight, out of mind most of the times. So nobody wants the environment to be polluted, but who is responsible for its protection when it does get polluted, because this relationship of the society with nature gets strained. So I mentioned about the wellness session earlier. One of the things that the speaker mentioned repeatedly is about being in nature, how that's a great source of relieving of stress and happiness in general. So we need to rethink and reimagine our relationship with nature. And the final point I'd like to make is in the changing nature of social contract is about investment in human capital and networks, which also includes the informal sector and community at large. As societies advance, there's a lot of emphasis that is placed on technological innovation, but there are also efforts, and rightfully so, in looking back at traditional knowledge and practices which were lost along the way and accounted for much of communities' resilience in the past. We are facing challenges of an unprecedented nature. So there is an argument to be made that earlier practices may not work anymore, but there is also an argument of bringing back many of the traditional practices which worked, you know, centuries ago, and knowledge that resides in the minds of traditional communities, indigenous communities, tribal communities, and looking for ways to integrate them within the decision making and tackling many of the societal problems today, especially those relating to environmental change and climate change. So I'll stop my comments there, and I'll be happy to address any questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Srija. And I was happy to note you said you'd be happy to respond to some questions. I think happiness is a key theme already emerging from our talk. So before we get to some questions, and before I introduce our next speaker, remember, don't forget to vote on the 3 polls for you on both the Facebook chat and also in the Zoom chat as well. The instructions are there for you to follow. So with that, we turn to our Our final speaker, before we begin in a moderated panel discussion of the importance of happiness and also what that means in terms of social contracts, I turn to my colleague, Professor Alfred Wu, who is Assistant Dean Research and Associate Professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He also has got a lengthy bio. Just briefly, he earned his PhD from City University of Hong Kong, where he was the recipient of the German Academic Exchange Service DAD Scholarship, and won the Outstanding Academic Performance Award for research degree students. He previously served as an associate professor in the Department of Asia and Policy Studies at the Education University of Hong Kong, and a senior research associate in the Department of Public and Social Administration at City University of Hong Kong. And he was, from 2000 to 2007, a senior journalist in mainland China, where he received over a dozen awards and honors for outstanding journalism, both from Chinese and overseas organizations. His interests include public sector reform, central-local fiscal relations, corruption and governance, and social protection in Greater China. With that, I welcome Professor Wu.
Thank you, Ben. COVID really offered a great opportunity to look into some basic in public management. Then in this academic year, I teach public management. We talk a lot about public sector motivation at a very micro level. In the meantime, we also talk about accountability and anti-corruption at the macro level. Can you actually just show the have the slide? Okay. But in the meantime, we will actually argue that accountability is just a mean. We do want to achieve something. So we discuss a lot about social values. But a social value, whether happiness is a part of our social value, then governments should pursue. And also in the meantime, in our public management literature, we find that a lot of people just think happiness is just about life satisfactions. Then if people are satisfied with the government service, then that's okay. In the meantime, we also need to rethink about what are our contracts with the government. So under this kind of question, I have a puzzle, particularly under COVID, why 4 Asian tigers, they are doing very differently. I would say that if you look into South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, many of them are doing something very, very good. Hong Kong was doing very good in terms of having everyone put on mask very early. Then Taiwan actually also was very good with the healthcare system. So my question is, then why many places like Hong Kong, they were very much panic and also had a lot of dispute about government policy. Then we had one project about that. I collaborate with my former colleague in Hong Kong. Next slide, please. And also, can you hear me? Okay, next slide. We published an article already. We mostly concerned about the law of social trust, particularly the trust in government actually impact people's perception of COVID measures. So maybe next slide. In general, we have the following finding. We invest a lot of countries, but in the meantime, we only actually try to get some data in 6 East and Southeast Asia regions during COVID pandemic, particularly in early 2020. Then our results suggest that government trust was negatively associated with stress. So it means that among old folks, if they have better trust in government, they are much better off. So next slide. if you can look into these statistics, you can find that in Hong Kong and Taiwan and also Singapore, trust in hospital almost are the same. But if we look into the stress level, Hong Kong actually much higher than Singapore and Taiwan. Why? The important factor is trust in government. You can see trust in government in this table. Singapore actually ranked very high, but in the meantime, Hong Kong actually ranked very low. So my own add to the happiness and also public management research is that we really need to pay attention to social trust and also these law and also in fighting all kinds of pandemic in the future. Ben, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alfred, and for broadening up the conversation to questions of trust, social contracts, and happiness. It's fascinating that we've gone from a conversation around happiness as an abstract concept and then delved into what it means to have a social contract around security. And now we also end up in the question of trust. And it leads me to my first question for you, panelists, which is, I'm wondering if you can reflect on, each of you in your own way, how we would unpack, if we can actually think about happiness as a very measurable thing that we can plot on a graph and say, in a static way, this country is more happy than other countries' populations, or whether that very approach that definitely brings in a large end data statistical analysis technique might actually obfuscate what are very different variables underneath that. In fact, in all of your talks, you've mentioned specific measures to me that I hadn't really thought were necessarily happiness, but you used them to show that this is part of your definition of happiness. For example, I thought that people in any one day might go from being kind of down to being happy in the same day, depending upon their certain day-to-day lives and perspectives. Whereas somebody who, let's say, doesn't have a job or doesn't have security from a social system might be happy from time to time, but overall they're insecure. So I'm wondering whether happiness is the right term to begin with for this kind of conversation, or whether, for example, the Srija's talk on the environment, whether another term might be not so much happiness as in haha, but rather purpose. And perhaps purpose and a place in society, a feeling of belonging, might be a way to capture both the social contract arguments and the idea behind happiness overall. But I'd be curious about that in the context of what that means for the research each of you are doing on these abstract notions of happiness and contracts. So why don't we start in the same order that you spoke and turn first to Professor Xinwang.
Thank you very much, Ben, for the very interesting question. I mean, if my understanding is correct, that you're asking the definition and concept of the happiness, and whether there could be other better term to replace it, such as a sense of belonging or purpose of life or something like that. Okay. Well, as I briefly mentioned in my presentation, well, the happiness actually have a few dimensions there. Generally, there are 3 dimensions: the positive emotion, negative emotion, that generally reflect more about our day-to-day life events. So it's flexible and changing a lot. However, the third dimension, which is called life evaluations or cognitive aspect of our happiness, is much more stable, and it's much more associated with like social, economic, political, and our living circumstances, and it's like to be commute with our daily events. So it's much more stable. In addition, actually, some people also claim that the eudaimonia could be one of the components, which is also called, purpose of life or the meanings of life. Well, statistically, we found that the purpose of life is highly correlated with the life evaluations, but not so much correlated with the emotion. So it's like if people feel a sense of a purpose in their life, or generally they would have been a very high level of life evaluations. They're very highly correlated. Well, we also study the correlation between like the social factors such as the social trust, political trust, and sense of belonging to a community, and the social network and social interaction, the frequency of social interactions, the size of your network. We study all those factors empirically about their correlation between happiness. And we do see that these social and political trust and also the sense of belongings are very important, covariates of the happiness. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to the next one, I was just thinking in my own head, okay, but if sense of belonging is correlated with happiness, is there also a problem of tautological inferences potentially in the variables? That's probably a broader question that we can get into today, but I'm curious then about whether or not the hook of happiness, given it's an abstract concept, is the one that's most useful for thinking about happiness. But I just raised that for future conversations. And now let's turn it over to Prof. Koho.
Hi. When I saw the title, my first instinct was to say that in my research, I kind of specialize in misery rather than happiness. So I felt when you study poverty, you kind of feel like you spend a lot of time scrutinizing poverty, and I mean misery and unhappiness. But I think that would not be a fair representation of that field of research. At the very least, I think that field of research is about, a lot of social policy research is motivated by wanting to find ways to avoid misery, right? And one of the kind of broader based projects that we did in the last few years was to talk to diverse members of public and to ask them to spell out a definition of a basic standard of living. This is part of our minimum income standards project, which tries to establish how much money people need for a basic standard of living. But before we can talk about the things and the money and their costs, we ask people to say what a basic standard of living in Singapore means. And in that textual definition, it occurred to me some of the concepts that Ben mentioned. So people say that a basic standard of living in Singapore must enable a sense of belonging. So that's there. Respect, by which they mean both respect from other people as well as self-respect, security, independence, freedom, and opportunities, right? So those are kind of the intangibles. Of course, they also talk about the material and so on. So to me, those are, in my work so far, out of all these terms, a lot of our attention has been on security. How stable and assured do you feel about your current situation in life? And then we also study people's kind of optimism and how they look towards the future. Do they think that things will become better? What is the outlook? Or do they feel that there is nothing to look forward to, right? This, I'm afraid, is as close as I come to studying happiness.
That's an interesting point too, because again, if they feel security, is that correlated with happiness, or is that simply a measure of happiness? I think is one kind of issue we can be pondering in this conversation as academics, but also as extrapolating our lessons from our research to questions of happiness and security. And in that context, Srija, before you answer, I just wanted to ask you to reflect, as you do, on, you and I both work on the environment, and I often say to my students, why are you guys so happy? The topics we're studying are not exactly, happy topics. Climate change, species extinctions, kind of depressing, right? And the answer is, and I spent 18 and a half years at Yale's environment school, all very happy, enthusiastic people. I'm now teaching classes in sustainability and LKYSPP, happy, engaged people. Why? I think the answer is they have purpose. They have purpose. They want to actually try and make a dent on this. And so they're not happy as in ha, 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 but they're enthusiastic in ways that I think give them, really good mental health, but also a sense of belonging to a broader thing beyond their individual selves. So Shrija, you mentioned people walking in the forest, but that's being used in the literature on environment to kind of say, well, but we're kind of making this around humans then, getting things for themselves. But the purpose one is actually humans giving things to the world. And I'm wondering how you think about that in the context of the walking through the forest and happiness hypothesis.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. You bring an interesting kind of aspect on, is it a static, is happiness static or, a dynamic kind of entity, which varies by the minute, by the hour, by the day. And I was thinking of, nowadays, there are so many mindfulness sessions which tell you to be in the moment. And when you're in the moment, like kids, very much in the moment, you're probably happier because you're cutting yourself off from the past or the future and, right here, right now. But when we think of policy making, without that kind of foresight or without building on things from the past, legacy issues or what has worked in the past, to look at things in a very static manner could be very detrimental. So when we come into policy making, it's very difficult to be in the moment and be very kind of happy and at peace at the moment. But when it comes to, say, environment, the relationship of people with the environment, there can be this duality in terms of you feel extremely frustrated that, climate negotiations and talks, for example, it took ages. I mean, the science was moving much, much faster than the rate at which policy decisions were being made because of a lot of politics and negotiation. But so there could be a frustration of, we know all this, why isn't any action happening? But at the same time, you could also be charged up by the sense of purpose that you're mentioning, that, there is hope, there is still time to reverse how things, mistakes of the past, or we know better, or there is this hope in the future that we can reverse many of the wrongdoings in the past, or we can create a better future together. So I think there is this duality to it. There's a lot of frustration, but the sense of purpose purposefulness can actually drive a lot of action as well. So I personally feel there is both type of kind of communities within environmental policy and environmental policy action.
Thank you. That's really useful. And as we turn to Alfred, I just want to raise a thought based on your response and also then to Alfred's response, which is I'm wondering whether happiness is something we use simply as a term to capture complex phenomenon, or whether it's something we want people to go and try and achieve, like become happy. And that changes the measure. It was an active kind of way to try and do it if you're not. The other is simply a measure of complex ways in which people see the world and their governments and trust their governments. And I was talking to psychology professor at Yale and US a few weeks ago, and she told me she works in happiness and psychology. And now this is an amazing topic, right? Because, for example, at Yale, where I was, the largest attended class by far was a class on happiness. But this is around students who wanted to become happy. They were focused on themselves. They wanted to become happy. And most came from very privileged backgrounds, by the way, but didn't feel happy. But this professor at Yale and US College told me, she said, there's a happiness paradox in psychology literature, where the more you're trying to achieve happiness, the more unhappy you are, which I find very itself fascinating. And I think it relates then to the social trust issue. Alfred, if people are saying that they trust governments or don't, are you saying that happiness plays a role, or more is it the social contract that plays a role in this kind of trust of government in the context of our conversation today?
Thanks, Ben. Very interesting comment. And also, when I look into happiness science, a lot of debate about X and Y, and the same will be associated with social trust. But in the meantime, I will observe that social trust is not actually just come overnight. if you look into Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, social trust also does not actually come after COVID. Basically, it's all along. Then government make policy very transparent. Government try to engage people. They have some other mechanism working to help to boost social trust. But my presentation would like to bring attention to the policymaker. Even you have very good healthcare system, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, almost the same. But in the meantime, you need to work on social trust. Try to boost the trust between the public and the government. Otherwise, all kind of effort, all kind of hard infrastructure cannot actually turn into a better strategies, particularly in some sort of event like COVID-19.
Thank you. It's amazing how these conversations get really fascinating. And there are many, many questions now that I want to pose, but time is moving along. So before we get to the audience part of the conversation about whether we actually do want to become happy or simply we want to think about how do we create people who are having trust in government, feel content and feel secure, and that therefore happiness of some kind is a byproduct. As we get in those conversations, we first want to go to the poll results. So I'm now going to do that. And the first question on the poll results is, what do you think is the most important factor to balance out policy outcomes to people's rate of happiness? A, more financial assistance and aid schemes for critical social challenges. B, rewriting employability and employment. C, transform current initiatives in country social agencies. And D, boost research and ground initiatives to collect data for jurisdictions and in decisions. So let's see the result of that poll. Shall we? Yeah, that's actually fascinating, eh? So that might get to the 2x2 table quite nicely in that this response is saying, employability important, but financial assistance for being unemployed might be the way to think more about these questions in this context. So that I think is a fascinating poll.
And there's no interest in research at all, Ben. I don't know what we should make of that.
I don't get it, because doing research makes me happy. That's all I can say. It's really, we have purpose and mission, right? And the byproduct is happiness. I wasn't trying to be happy, but it happens. I even think having this kind of conversation, the byproduct is curiosity about the world that we use to be applied in some way, which is the mission of our school, taking our knowledge and making it useful. Makes us, again, the result might be happy. We didn't try to achieve it, it was the result. And I think that's an important theme emerging from your research. So research does matter here. Okay, next question is, do you agree that social factors will greatly impact the world in the next 10 years? A, yes, I agree. Social cohesion, social mobility, and inequality will be the biggest challenges of our times. B, no, I don't think it's easy to say that these are the only factors because there's so much at stake. C, yes and no. I think this can drive policymaking decisions, but not be the only issue. And D, maybe. But technological advances may change the way we look at social challenges. Okay, so what are the results for this one? Drum roll. We have none for yes and no. Wow. And then social cohesion, mobility, and inequality are the biggest challenges of our time. So that's obviously fascinating response there. And I think it reinforces what's coming up in this panel, that a social contract of some kind may help and change the quote unquote happiness outcomes that we see. And given the context in which the world is in right now, and increasing polarization and conflict, ecologically and economically and politically, this makes some sense and it resonates. Okay, third question. What do you think people depend on policymakers to uplift their quality of life for family welfare, healthcare, and medical assistance. This might be more of the misery, like avoiding misery point that was made. B, financial aid, benefits, and/or assistance. C, education, skills training, and job challenges. And D, household housing. Okay. So where do we want governments to make us the most happy? Drum roll, poll results. Oh, wow. Oh, that's interesting. Look at this. So I would have thought it would be on the avoiding misery side, but it's not. It's on the education, skills training, and job challenges side. That, again, reinforcing the 2x2 table, I think quite nicely, too, as a way to think about the world and where people fit. And maybe this is in the context of Singapore, too. And it may go back to my question about, do we want to risk the Singapore miracle? Well, you wouldn't risk it by increasing education and skills training and job challenges. Coco, did you want to respond to that at all, this third poll? Any thoughts?
Not specifically, but I've been dying to ask a question, and I was wondering if I'm allowed, because I think if I don't ask it, I might not be able to sleep tonight.
Share's prerogative, and you want to sleep and be happy, so go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I desperately wanted to ask both Shun and Alfred a question, which is it, and I'm going to sound very unlearned because, as I said, I study misery rather than happiness. Is if the goal is happiness, what are we to make of? If, let's say, we were to conduct a poll in a totalitarian state where standards of living are very poor, health standards very poor, education, so-called the objective indicators all show that the population is not doing well, right? But the population say they are very happy. What are we to make of that, right? Is the goal to increase people's happiness, or are we saying there's a more objective way to look at whether their happiness is deserved, right? So I'm referring in particular to kind of our greater awareness now of how manipulable sentiment is. I know Shun mentioned there is both a cognitive and emotive aspect to it. So just in the age of populism and kind of post-truth and polarization, we know people are manipulable. So if a totalitarian leader can make a population very happy, are we saying that's all right? So I mean, along the similar line, I wanted to ask Alfred, again, if an objectively bad leader somehow manages, and bad leaders often are very good at this, right? They manage to foster very strong trust in government. So if people trust a bad government, as public policy scholars, is it a good outcome for us?
Well, okay, let me respond first. I'm not sure the situation you described exists. So it's hypothetical, right? A totalitarian government doing a lot of bad things, but I'm not sure you said make people really happy or they force them to stay happy. Well, if the people cannot tell their true feelings, well, it's nonsense, right? That means they're not happy. It doesn't reflect the fact. But if that is true, that people are really happy, well, under such kind of system, it's not a forced by the government, it's not manipulated by the poll. Well, I don't know if such kind of case exists. So there are many hypothetical situations like people are poor, isolated in a community, but people are happy. But in reality, it simply does not exist. The people are not silly, you know. They know what they're doing. They know what's going on, even in such kind of a totalitarian government. So if they are okay or safe to express their true feeling, you know they are not happy. So you cannot make that kind of assumption, I think. Thank you.
Maybe we just make it a very much like the case of China. You know, it's an authoritarian country. Then you could say that the trust level is quite high compared.
I was exactly thinking of China.
Compared with other countries. Yeah, but you also can see that the trust on different things may be very differently. If you ask a Chinese or like whether you trust government, they will say they have trust in government. But if we ask some more detailed question about whether you trust in healthcare system, or whether you trust in COVID measure, then the answer will be very different. So finally, if you try to boil down to some very detailed question and also associate with the life experience, then you could see the answer. The answer may not be social trust is so high in China.
And there's one more thing. The happiness level in China is also not very high. And
Yes.
we know Singapore is the best one, and Taiwan region is also very good.
Yes.
But Hong Kong is not. So I'm very surprised by the poll result that nobody care about housing. So I guess it's the respondents are mainly very young people. So they care about education skills, but not housing. So I think probably just from young people.
Yeah, I want to come back to this question of what governments should or could do on some measure of happiness or avoiding misery, and then ask you to extrapolate from that also the broader work outside the topic of this conversation, but also on the psychological dimensions, which, as you all know, the public health challenges associated with political unhappiness are related to each other. We can't avoid them. And we're told from the psychologists that we're probably in some of the most stressful and anxious times that society has been in around the world in a long time. So I'm wondering, in the context of what governments can do as public policies, on the one hand, I see the misery one, working quite well, like providing some kind of basic income or healthcare and so on. But what about on the just being happy side? Singapore has got all kinds of awesome things the government has done for people to enjoy life in a moment. Whether it be L'Esplanade, free music, whether it be Sentosa, whether it be this amazing Jewel, with all these experience, and then of course hiking trails and so on. The government's policies, the Garden City, have created this sense of places you can be day-to-day happy, as well as in some way secure. But then what can individuals do? So we're told individuals they can decide to go for a hike, they can exercise, but it's more individual. So where do we come down on this question of, from your research, what should be the purview of government? And what should be the purview just of individuals, deciding if they want to be happy to then, go for a run, right? Where do we come down on this? Maybe we'll go back to start with Shun again and do our same sequence. But Shun, what do you think about that? Who's got responsibility for this?
Well, I think according to research, both governments and individuals can do something and to improve their happiness. And I'm not sure, whether the Yale professor saying is right that people want to be happy, become unhappy. Well, actually, from the literature, we know that there are many ways to improve, at least what individuals can do to improve their happiness. It's like you increase your social interactions, and you have someone to count on, and you have a very good, family and a good relations with your family members, and also you have that donation and volunteering. Those factors, individual, efforts can be correlated with your happiness. But economics actually do not care that much about the individual efforts, since that they think happiness will be an outcome of the social, economic, and political environment, because we have many evidence showing that if people migrate from an unhappy country to a happy country, and gradually they will just their happiness level will be converged to the local residents. That means it's that the environment probably is a key factor for people's happiness. It's not just your individual efforts. If you put very optimistic people into a very miserable environment, probably he will not be that happy. So we care more about the policy, so that we can, to improve the people's living standard, and also social cohesion and equality, gender equality, and also, economic equality. So as we show from the World Happiness Ranking, that the Scandinavian countries are generally very happy, and also like New Zealand, Australia, and Australia and Canada are doing also very, very well. We know that they have very good, social security system, and people do not worry too much about their life. and there are many opportunities. People are equal, and so those kind of social aspects also very, very important for people's happiness, not just personal, efforts. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so you're saying that both matter in some way, but I'm just wondering, and we'll get to the others in a second. I want to push you though on one point you made. Yeah. You said you weren't sure about the Yale professor's comments on this paradox, and I can appreciate that. On the other hand, you said volunteering is one way to gain happiness, but volunteering is what she was talking about, which is instead of focusing on yourself, how do I get happy because I'm a self-interested person who wants to be happy? You don't do that. You think about others. And by thinking of other people and even bringing security to other people, you become happy as a byproduct. So wouldn't that be consistent with the Yale professor's paradox?
Well, I'm not sure if I get the theory clearly. I mean, if I know that, spending on others, no matter, spending money or time can make me happy or make people happy, then probably we can tell more people to do this, right? Helping others make yourself happy. Well, I'm not sure if everybody knows that, but in China, people are trying to tell people you should help others to create, a good society. But they don't tell people, okay, helping others will make yourself happy. If people know that, I think that if you do that, I mean, that won't make you unhappy, right? If you help others.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting point. But I think it does relate to the complex causality of these questions. And a second related question was, based on your research, given you're looking at country level indicators, I'm wondering whether that's the best measure, because countries are lines on a map that hide lots of differences inside of them. And in fact, China's got 33 provinces, Canada has 10 provinces that are quite distinct, the US 50 states, and you can extrapolate to the broad level, but if you did the state level analysis, you get very different variations. So are countries the best unit, or maybe is class a better unit to look at? Or what made you decide that countries would be your core unit of analysis in this research project?
Well, we know the country rankings are attractive, right? And people want to know which country are happier than others. But we do know their internal variation. But in general, as far as I know, the internal variation is not that big. So, but the variation across countries are very big. I'm not saying that country level analysis is the best one, but I mean, all kinds of analysis deserves, right? So internal variations also, important, but in our data, we only have those country rankings so that we can know better about what's going on in different countries. Because in the whole country, it have the same political system and same, financial system, all those kind of stuff are kind of similar. But of course, there are internal variations which deserve, attention. Yeah.
Yeah, and like where I'm from in Vancouver, oftentimes we talk about the Cascadia region that covers the U.S. and Canada, which is on the West Coast. And so people that do countries miss these actually more important geographic units because of the way people on the West Coast are a bit more outdoorsy and happy, or actually because of the rain, depressed. I want to get to actually the next three, though. We only got 12 minutes left. And I really want to get your thoughts on then what governments can do, what individuals can do in this context of the research. And Coco, your point about your looking at misery, I think really tells us a lot about then this question. What can individuals do in your story here, or is it all governments?
Yeah, I mean, recently I caught a film called Plan 75. I don't know if there are others in the audience who have seen it. It's a Japanese film directed by Chie Hayazawa, I think. And it's about thankfully a fictional premise that in Japan, because it's such a fast aging society and they are running out of resources to take care of older people, so they have introduced a policy where older people can sign up to be put out of their misery once they reach the age of 75. Right? They can volunteer to have their lives be ended by the state. And it's this very dystopian kind of situation where they have road shows and very cheerful public servants promoting it as if it's just another service. It could be a job matching service, if you didn't know what they were trying to do. And if you do sign up for this package, they give you $1,000 to spend and enjoy yourself a little bit before you go to the facility for the final trip. So of course, I mean, when I saw the film, I thought this is a film about a social contract. right?
Right.
I mean, your question reminded me of the film because it seems to put all the responsibility on the individual. You can, well, we have this. If you choose to stay alive, you can look for work.
Yeah.
We have social assistance and so on. But if you don't want to do any more of this, there is the other option, which is Plan 75, right? But I think the film is really forcing us to think of the real question, which is what sort of society would that be the best option, right? And our answer to that question is the articulation of a social contract, right? That there are a lot of things that governments can do to provide support, to provide opportunity, so that at the individual level, Plan 75 is an unattractive and irrational choice, right? So for me, I mean, we are also in the business of analyzing public policy. I believe there is always within a set of parameters, the individual has a lot of room to make decisions, but the job of policymakers is to design the architecture of choice and opportunity so that the choices people make would be happy ones.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that would also then perhaps lower costs on the mental health side if you brought in this kind of framework as well. So some cost savings there too at that level, individual collective interaction effects. But fascinating. I do want to get to Srija and Alfred next. So Srija, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, so I just want to bring in culture and what the baseline is for happiness as well. So happy with respect to what? Those, for example, those who live in cities, they love the madness and the chaos of cities. And those who live in kind of, spaces where there's big houses, big space, there's no cluttering of people, they love that. But, when people come to Singapore, some of them love the fact that everything is convenient, everything is close by. And sometimes others might just feel, it's too much in a small space. So I think the question of what the baseline is when we measure happiness, what makes one happy, is always kind of relative to some baseline and what you're used to. And over here, I think culture matters as well. So you brought about you were asking about the role of government. So some cultures value freedom more than anything else, and some cultures might value kind of some direction, some guidance, even if there is from the leaders, just tell us what to do. And, so I think the culture also matters, and that kind of governs what people are willing to take in terms of the government role and how satisfied or dissatisfied they might feel with what the government suggests that societies do or their citizens do to be prosperous, to be happy.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Alfred, where do you come down on this?
Thanks, Ben. I would say that particularly under new public governance, we really pay attention to the interaction between the people and the government. But in the meantime, I would say that I agree with Professor Wang about the law of environment on sweeping different things. Then, for example, in the context I research like Hong Kong and Singapore, I would say that all Asian societies, they face the same problem. I would say I echo co-host concern. But if you look into Hong Kong's situation early this year, just within 2 months, 9,000 older people died because of COVID. Then they believe in different kind of misinformation about vaccination. Singapore was very, very good in terms of pushing up the vaccination rate at a very early stage. But Hong Kong side, the government should do much more to persuade people and also to make them much more transparent about vaccination. But a lot of people die not because of health infrastructure is not there, it's because of misinformation. They did not have any vaccine when COVID hit them. So I would say that we still need to emphasize a lot about the role of government.
Yeah, I mean, your point about COVID in Singapore and Hong Kong is fascinating because, you know, as somebody who spent 21 years in the US before I came here, you know, I often say that if somebody told me, I came here January 2020, if someone told me there's going to be a global pandemic, where do you want to be in the world? I'd be like, I want to be in Singapore. I mean, this is a really incredible story of very low death rates, education, quick responses to the changing knowledge and so on, which, you know, reflected the ability of government to do really strong and meaningful public policy with that degree of trust that was needed. But I'm curious though, like, I'm trying to think about the two concepts we're dealing with today, happiness and social contract in the context of COVID. And do you, I mean, I can see the trust part for sure, but on the trust part you're discussing, is that more about how the contract works in your work, or is trust a separate part to a contract? How do you come down on these three pillars? Alfred, I'm curious, Alfred.
Yeah. Yes, I would say that it's a very complicated research question. X and Y always. And also the means and end. So in general, I would say that based on these kind of observation and particularly our latest, we really need to pay attention to the interaction among different stakeholders, and also of course, Singapore is lucky we have like culture to promote the trust in government. But in the meantime, of course, in other contexts, they also need to do more.
Yeah. One final question. We got almost no time left. We've been talking about what governments can do and individuals can do. But what about other areas? Corporations, transnational efforts, intergovernmental processes, NGOs. What about other arenas besides government and individuals for promoting real security and happiness? And I know we got almost no time, but any sort of quick thoughts on other areas for fostering that?
I would say that NGO play extremely important role in normal times, right. But in some like pandemics, particularly like COVID, you can see Hong Kong had a very vibrant civil society in the past, but it almost collapsed in early this year. So it really depends on government's action and also people's trust in government. Otherwise, it will lead to a lot of policy failures.
Right.
Yeah, I just want to add in the relation to disasters. So the informal sector in many developing countries actually has played a major role in on community networks, has played a major role more than governments in many instances. Before formal help reaches them, so community networks do, and NGOs, civil society at large, do play a major role in this disaster relief, rehabilitation.
Well, just one more thing I want to add is about what firms or corporates can do to promote happiness, not just in the it's kind of disaster timing, but also in when things back to normal. Well, there are also studies on this area that the environment in a firm matters a lot. It's like those kind of environments, like soft environment, not just your salary or whatever promotion. Instead, these kind of your relation between their subordinates and their leaders. Very important, and also the social trust among their co-workers are also very important determinants of their happiness. It's not just income; it's like their workplace environment, whether it's a horizontal environment, whether it's a trustful environment. Those factors matter a lot for people's happiness, and also retain whether people will quit their job, those kind of rotation rate. So there are workplace environment does matter.
Thank you. Coco, did you want to have the last word on that?
No, I just want to second that in our kind of an ongoing study of gig workers. What Shun said about some of those kind of workplace dynamics. I mean, you were saying that a gig worker has no workplace, right? I mean, I'm referring to platform workers, food delivery workers. But when we ask them what they enjoy or dislike about their work, those kind of fleeting encounters and kind of transient relationships, they talk about that a lot. That there are interactions with the company, which they never see, right? But they will call on the phone if there's a problem with the order. Their encounters with customers, encounters with other riders that they meet on the route. They talk about those things. Yeah.
You know, that's fascinating. Time's up now, but the small little connections go both ways. So if you're a service worker and you get a negative or sort of put down from some customer, you can have a really bad day. But likewise, you can have a very positive one when you have that kind of meaningful engagement both ways. And that's probably a good take home from this conversation, is that we as individuals can play a role in how we respect others, be it other individuals, other communities, or the environment. And also we can be part of a broader collective endeavor, whether it be at the level of an NGO corporation or part of the government, to make meaningful and systemic transformations too. So I want to thank you for this. I am very happy with the outcome of this conversation and where you brought us both intellectually, but also in terms of taking your work and drawing out the meaningful parts of it for applied policy analysis and policy responses. So thank you very much, all four of you, for a wonderful, engaging conversation. And I wish you all, and the audience, thank you for coming, and I wish you all a good night.